Right, let's get started, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. I'm your host, Chris Smith, here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. It's good to be with you for another Wednesday edition of our program. Now, the Lunchtime Discovery Series is brought to you, broadcast by us here at the museum, but it's organized and coordinated by the folks at the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education. We work with them in order to bring you a great program almost every single week. For the month of March, we've been celebrating Women's History Month. We've been hearing from incredible people doing amazing work out there in science and nature and conservation, hearing their stories, gaining their insights, and learning about their expertise. And I think today is going to be no different as we learn about and recognize achievements that women here in North Carolina are making today. It's been very special. I'll remind everybody that the Lunchtime Discovery Series is interactive. That's right. You're not just here to watch a great presentation. You're here to watch a great presentation and then ask questions. That's right. So if you're watching on YouTube, I want to see you, if you would like to, up in the chat. Let us know maybe where you're viewing today's program from, or at least drop a little waving hands emoji to say hi. But of course, if you have questions throughout the program, make sure that you type those up and drop them in the chat. I'll be looking to your questions after the presentation, and we'll moderate a Q&A with today's guest speaker. If you're watching over on Facebook, you can do the same thing. Just make sure that you're using the comments. I'm keeping an eye on both of those so that we can have a great conversation and discussion after today's presentation. Now, for today's presentation, as things are warming up, maybe you're thinking about heading out to the coast for a long weekend or a vacation. But I don't think we're going to be talking about vacationing so much as what's happening on the coast here in North Carolina. Maybe some interesting things that you could remember on your visits coming up soon. Although I'm looking at the chat now, and there are several folks who are already at the coast who are tuning in. So that's exciting. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Let me introduce today's guest. Let me get to it. Stacy Zhang is a postdoctoral researcher at UNC's Institute of Marine Sciences and joins me now. Hi, Stacy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here to talk to you about my background, as well as my research that investigates the effects of hurricanes on North Carolina fishes. All right, so let's get started. And so I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself and my background and how I came to be so interested in hurricanes. So I was born and raised in North Carolina, and I was 6 years old when Hurricane Fran hit North Carolina. For those of you who were here for this, or for you weren't here, Hurricane Fran came ashore and made landfall at the mouth of the Cape Fear River down in Wilmington as a Category 3. And so that meant that there were sustained winds of 115 miles per hour as this hurricane made landfall. And it made landfall with a 12-foot storm surge, right? So if you can imagine your home, the entire first floor of your home being flooded, that's what a 12-foot storm surge is going to do. And it was a massive storm. So it dropped over 9 inches of rain over portions of the Piedmont area in North Carolina. And if you can imagine also what it looks like when you get that much rain in some of our more inland soils, essentially what that does is it turns the soil into pancake batter. And what you see happening is what you see in this photo here on the bottom left, where trees fall over and the entire root mass is exposed. Whereas down at the coast, you tend to see more snapping of trees. And so I remember I grew up an hour south of Raleigh, and I remember going to bed that night and I slept like a rock, but I woke up the next day and walked outside my house and I just saw down trees everywhere. We were very lucky that none of them hit our home, but there were trees all over the road and we were pretty much trapped within our little neighborhood. You could not get in and out. And I still remember to this day, we were out of power for a week during this time period. And my parents at the time owned a restaurant that had the power restored pretty soon after the storm, and the restaurant cooked using gas. And they would walk, because we couldn't get the cars out because the trees were down, to the restaurant, which was about 2 miles away, and make food for the community in order to also get rid of the food that was in the fridges and freezers. And they brought food home because, as I said, there were portions that didn't have their electricity restored for over a week. And so you can only imagine what that's going to do to our local communities. And so fast forward about, 15 years now, 12 years, Hurricane Florence came to shore in North Carolina in 2018. And I was a graduate student at the Duke Marine Lab at the time. And there's a really amazing, kind of strange but fun tradition at the Marine Lab, where historically there were 2 professors that would come to the Marine Lab during the eye of the hurricanes and play croquet. You can't do that anymore because the campus is shut down for the entire duration of the storm. But the graduate students have continued this tradition. We now play croquet before we all evacuate. And so I still remember putting away all of my things and preparing for this storm, because at the time that it was marching its way to North Carolina, it was a Category 3, not far off our shorelines. And I still remembered Hurricane Fran in my mind. And I could only imagine what it would be like to live through that at the coast when it made landfall. And so we packed up all of our prized possessions, and most of us evacuated. And I'm very glad that I did, because this storm was moving at only 4 knots when it made landfall. And so it just sort of sat over portions of southern coastal North Carolina. And it dropped 24 to 30 inches of rain over portions of Wilmington, portions of Carteret County, and dropped 4 to 6 inches of rain in Raleigh. But of course, I was very lucky, and I evacuated to New York City at the time to visit a good friend of mine. And I still remember just feeling this sense of fear and dread, because I had no idea what was happening back home. I worried about the people that I knew had stayed, and I could see, you just get inundated with news reports of what's happening. And when I came back, I saw this massive devastation across Carteret County, essentially. Driving down the roads, it's not just the downed trees. You see people emptying out their homes of furniture, photo albums, ripping out walls, because there was just so much devastation from this storm raining in through people's roofs and ripping out the siding and flooding. And it really also made me think about, what does it mean to be a resilient community on the coastline that has to plan for these sort of disasters in a global climate change scenario? And what does that mean for the habitats and the ecosystems, as well as the people over time? And so now I'll get into some of the more sciencey things. So it's probably not a surprise to many of us that we are experiencing global climate change. Atmospheric temperatures compared to the median of the middle of the 20th century have increased by over a degree of 1 degree of Celsius. And with this increase in atmospheric temperatures, we're seeing an increase in our sea surface temperatures, and our oceans are in fact warming. So what I'll draw your attention to here, hopefully y'all can see my mouse, is that atmospheric or sea surface temperatures are not warming uniformly across the globe. And you'll notice that along the eastern seaboard of the United States, it's much redder, which indicates to us that our oceans have warmed substantially more along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And so with this increase in atmospheric temperatures and sea surface temperatures, we're seeing this pretty substantial increase in the number of natural disasters across the entire globe. These blue portions here are the number of floods, and the teal portions is just extreme weather. One of these natural disasters that I'm going to talk to you about is tropical cyclones. And so since the mid-1990s, we've seen a pretty strong increase in the number of tropical cyclones that we've experienced. And this is partially due to a climatic phenomenon known as the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which is kind of similar to El Nino, but it occurs over multiple decades. And it is a large driver of North Atlantic climatic variability. And so during AMO warm periods, we tend to see more active hurricane seasons versus AMO cold periods where we tend to see less active hurricane periods. But if we think about the overall intensity of an entire hurricane season, and we calculate out the intensity of that season using what we call the power dissipation index, which adds all of the intensities of the hurricanes that occur that year, and we plot that in our dashed line, we see that it's actually pretty strongly correlated with sea surface temperatures. But if we compare the last AMO warm period with our current AMO warm period, we are seeing hurricane intensities or season intensities that are more than double what they have been in the past. And so it is predicted with climate change that we're going to see an increase in tropical cyclone intensity. All right, and so what this means is that hurricanes are predicted to be windier. They're going to be associated with more rainfall, and they're going to affect larger geographical swaths. So what you see here in this GIF is an unfortunately great example of what I mean by geographical swaths. So this is Hurricane Ida from last year that came to shore in Louisiana as a Category 4, and the remnants of Hurricane Ida still dropped over half a foot of rain in portions of New York and spawned several tornadoes over portions of Cape Cod. Coastal North Carolina is an unfortunately great place to also study the effects of hurricanes. So Carteret County, Dare County, Hyde County are 3 of the top 5 most frequently impacted locations by hurricanes. And I also want to take this time to acknowledge that where I'm sitting right now in Carteret County, North Carolina, is on the ancestral lands of the Lumbee and Moosiaut tribes. And this is very important when we think about who is actually being affected by hurricanes and who is most vulnerable. Many of you who may have been here for Hurricane Matthew may recognize this photo from Lumberton, North Carolina, and that is in fact named after the Lumbee tribe. And so places like Lumberton, like Princeville, are constantly flooded by all of these major storms. And we really need to think about what it means to be a resilient community, not just on our coastlines, but in some of these inland coastal states that are in low-lying floodplains. But on the ecological front, we were interested in looking at how and if hurricanes have a measurable impact on seagrasses and their associated fish communities, if there was a relationship between hurricane intensity and change, and whether or not oyster reefs that we are trying to restore on our coastline are resistant to hurricanes. I want to give a major shout out to my collaborators on this research, Judd Kenworthy and Jesse Jarvis at UNCW, Rachel Gitman at ECU, Lauren Yeager, who is actually with DOD now, Savannah Swinney and Grace Roskar, who were researchers at UNC at the time that we started this, as well as Joel Faudry, who's also at UNC. And so why are we interested in seagrasses? So seagrasses are a foundation species, which means that they come into an otherwise unstructured bare habitat. And just by existing, they create habitat and they can ameliorate stressful conditions for other organisms to then be able to utilize that habitat and live within it. And so they do things like they're able to stabilize the sediment using their root masses and attenuate wave action. They are designated as essential fish habitat because of their important role in supporting juvenile fishes. And actually, studies have shown that they can reduce bacterial pathogens in the water. And so they give us so many essential services that really help to facilitate our being able to live at the coast. And fishes can also respond to hurricanes in a variety of different ways. So for some of our more offshore species and oceanic species, the studies have actually shown that they can detect orbital motion in the water, and that cues them to move to deeper waters and seek refugia there. Other studies have actually shown that some fishes and crustacean species, blue crabs, for example, can detect drops in barometric pressure and salinity associated with storms, and that cues them to move down estuary into more saline waters. And then some fishes, or elasmobranchs, have little to no response at all, and they just sort of hunker down and try and wait out the storm. And we're also interested in oyster reefs because they are a critical habitat that provide us so many ecosystem services. So they can enhance the water quality as filter feeders and removing particulates out of the water. They stabilize our shorelines. They are critical for carbon storage. They help to cycle nitrogen through our system. So you think about fertilizer runoff, oysters can help with the nitrogen mitigation on that front. They are an incredibly important commercial fishery in our state, and they also create habitat, similarly to how I was describing with the seagrass meadows. So to begin our study, we wanted to look at what the broad scientific literature has actually said about what hurricanes can potentially do to fish communities across a variety of coastal ecosystems, as well as to seagrasses. And so what we found is there's not as many studies on this topic as you would have expected, and the results are kind of variable. So in terms of the fish communities, a little more than half actually found that there was no long-term effect of hurricanes on overall fish numbers. If you look at the short term, so within 6 months of the storm making landfall or impacting the ecosystem, it's a little more variable. Some found that there was a short-term effect and then the populations recovered, and some found that there was no effect. For seagrasses, this switched a little bit more, in that only 4 out of our 17 papers found no short-term effect. 9 actually documented a decrease in percent cover, so a little more than half. And only 5 of these found no long-term effect. But what's notable about the studies we looked at is that only 2 of these actually looked at the effects of more than one storm. And those 2 studies looked at the effects of multiple storms within a single year, which is sort of where we come in. So in the last decade, coastal North Carolina has been impacted by over a dozen tropical cyclones, tropical storms, intensities, and above. We're going to focus our study primarily on the effects of hurricanes Irene, Florence, Dorian, and Isaias. And that's because these storms made landfall during peak hurricane season. And if you understand much about the seasonality of fishes in our local estuaries, they come into the estuary during spring and they leave the estuary during early fall. And so we're trying to minimize the effects of seasonality on our study. But these storms also were category 1 and above. And we wanted to really distinguish between the effects of a tropical cyclone versus an ordinary precipitation event. So we set up our study by using trawl surveys that have been conducted on a monthly basis by the Estuary and Ecology Lab at UNC. And we used surveys from 2010 to 2020. And we set up what's known as a before-after control impact study. And so what this does is that we designate no hurricane years as our control years. So this means that not even a hair of a storm grazed our coastline that year. And then we designate the years where we did have a category 1 and above storm as our impact years. And we subset the data again based upon time period before or after the storm. And this allows us to use separate treatments for different time periods and compare across these treatments. You'll also hear me refer to this as our Bakke study. And we also look to see whether or not the impacts of the storm were manifest over short-term periods, so within 3 weeks of the storm occurring, and across the entire season that we were monitoring these fishes, so from May through October. And we paired this with intermittent seagrass surveys to look at the overall persistence of the habitat. And what we found is if you think of catches or abundances within the estuary and you use catch per unit effort, so catches per trawl essentially, or per the amount of distance that you're surveying, there was no short-term effect, this top graph, no short-term interaction between year type and time period, which indicates to us that there wasn't an impact of storm. But if you look at the seasonal scale, we did find that there was a significant interaction. But if you take an even closer look at what's happening here, and you compare the changes between control versus impact years, you actually see that during our hurricane years, this only really equated to a loss of about 10 fishes more between time periods than during our control years. So it's not a huge change in the overall catch in the estuary. But because storms can also change not just the overall average number that you're seeing, they can also change the trends that you see over time. We plotted catches against days since storm, and we ran linear models against days since storm for each of our Bakke groups. So I want you to pay attention to is if you subtract our control versus impact years and you plot that difference, if this difference plus the general errors that are associated with the model overlap zero, that indicates to us that there is no difference in seasonal trends. And that's actually what we found here. If you look at overall species richness, you see again that there's no significant interaction between year type and time period at the short-term time scales, but at the seasonal time scale, there was a significant difference. But again, you have to take you have to understand what you're looking at here. So just the statistics aren't going to tell you necessarily what's happening. And even though there's a significant difference, this only really equates to a difference of about 0.3 species, which you can't actually have in a real world phenomenon, right? You can't lose part of a species. And again, if we look at our trends over time, what was interesting to us here is that what was different was our before period trends. So prior to the storm, during our control years, the average number of species per trawl that we found held steady at about 6 species constantly. But during our impact years, we saw an increase in species number from about 4 to 9. But after the storm, our trends tended to converge and there was no difference in after period trends. We're also interested to see if there was a difference in the overall structure of the communities we were observing. And so what you see plotted here are non-metric multidimensional scaling plots, which is a very fancy way of essentially saying that what you're looking at is how similar or dissimilar the communities are. So to walk you through what you're seeing here, our open points are before periods. The filled in points are after periods. Circles are control years and triangles are impact years. And if all of these treatments were different and the communities were different, you would see no overlap in where these symbols and points are falling out in space. But that is not what you see here. You see that all of these points are essentially falling on top of each other. And so that means the communities are pretty similar across all of our different Bakke treatments. And this is true at both our short-term and our seasonal timescales. If you really squint your eyes a little bit and you look at the group centroids for each of these treatments, which are plotted in red, you can see a slight distinguishment between the time periods, but you don't really see an effect of the actual hurricane itself. But we are also interested to see whether or not there were certain species that might be more sensitive to the effects of the storm. And so we did indicator species analysis. And actually what we found was that the fishes that contributed the most to group dissimilarities are also the fishes that are most abundant in our catches. So those are pinfishes, mahara fishes, pigfishes, and various flounder species. And so really what's driving the potential changes in our community are changes in highly abundant species and not necessarily, for example, a rare species that is highly impacted by the storm. And so we also wanted to compare whether or not our results were, they fell in line with some of the trends from commercial fisheries. And so what you see plotted here is a figure from Division of Marine Fisheries, and all of these gray bars are hurricane years. And if you compare catches during hurricane years to the year before, there are some years where the catches are higher than the year before, and there are some years where the catches are lower than the year before. And so it's kind of a mixed bag, and it does sort of align with what we found, that there doesn't seem to be a strong indication right now that hurricanes have a massive effect on the overall number of fishes in our estuary compared to a normal year without a storm. But what you don't see here is how intense that storm was. And so what we wanted to know is hurricane intensity associated with the overall magnitude of change? And so what we have plotted on our x-axis here is a measure of intensity known as the accumulated cyclone energy. And so that takes into account not only the wind speeds, which Saffir-Simpson is entirely based upon, but also the duration for which that wind speed was measured and experienced. And so you can sort of capture the relative difference in a storm that is slow and like a high wind speed storm that is moving slowly versus a high wind speed storm that's moving quickly. And so what we found was that at the short-term scale, there is a very strong correlation in the overall intensity of the storm with the magnitude of change. More intense storms led to greater declines in catch per unit effort, as well as species richness. And this was also true for catch per unit effort at the seasonal scale. And what I want to draw your attention to here is the intensity of Hurricane Florence compared to all the other storms that we examined. And so Hurricane Florence was in fact associated with the greatest amount of change that we observed. So what does this mean in terms of global climate change? If it is in fact predicted that we're going to get more intense storms in the future, what does it mean if we start to see storms like Hurricane Florence more regularly? Are our fish communities going to continue to be pretty resilient to these effects? And so we wanted to know if whether or not the habitat was persisting, because habitat can potentially underlie the ability of the fishes to come back into our estuaries each year. And so what you see plotted here are 4 separate seagrass meadows that we surveyed for percent cover. And these are also seagrass meadows where we also trawl. And what we found is that there's pretty consistent seasonal productivity patterns, regardless of whether or not it was a hurricane year or whether or not a hurricane occurred or didn't occur. So before and after. I'll draw your attention to here some of the trends where we saw that there was no obvious effect of Hurricane Dorian on our seagrass meadows. So between August to September, before and after Hurricane Dorian, no major effect in percent cover. And if you compare within a single month, so September in particular, and use September 2016 as before Hurricane Matthew and September 2019 as after that should be September 2018, I apologize, as after Hurricane Florence, you actually see that there's not a major change in percent cover, except for at one of our sites. But this could also be an indication that there's just an increasing amount of percent cover over those many years between those 2 September measurements. And so we also wanted to know whether or not the reefs that we've restored, because they are such an important habitat, have been resistant to storms over time. And so what you see on this map are over 20 oyster reefs that have been built by researchers at UNC's Marine Lab, and they're color-coded based upon essentially when the reefs were built. I'm going to show you a video now of how we've been tracking the fate of these reefs over time using aerial imagery. And so if you want to just follow along to what's happening inside these circles, you'll see little black dots. Sometimes they actually appear as white because they are actually oyster shells, blinking in and out over time. All right, well, in just that 10 seconds there, you've watched what we have in terms of 30 years of aerial imagery over portions of our sounds. And we can look whether or not these reefs were present and whether or not they've actually been there over time, and plot that using a probability of survival against time graph. So you often see graphs like this used more frequently for things like medical trials, and you're plotting the likelihood of survival prior to the between years. And what you actually see is that up until the 2018 period, these reefs were pretty resistant to some pretty substantial storms. So Bonnie and Floyd were pretty major hurricanes to this area. Hurricane Irene came ashore right at Cape Lookout, but these storms were pretty resistant. They seemed to still be okay regardless of the storms. They didn't die. But then we had two storms, Florence and Michael, come through that really caused a pretty substantial decline in the overall survival of these oyster reefs. And so if we think about what may be driving the changes on that front, these are all the reefs, again, that I showed you before. And these are the reefs, the ones that have X's over them, that we lost after 2018. And so we're interested on this front in exploring what might be driving the cause of decline for these reefs. And so we've gone through and we've done an oyster reef census to look at all of the reefs that are still existing that we've built, and we've mapped them to get an indication of the overall area, the elevation and relief, the morphology of these reefs, to see if it's correlated with overall reef survivorship. And we're also looking to see how protection and where this reef is within the landscape may affect the overall survivorship of the restored reefs. So for example, this reef here that was built in the 1990s, it's doing great. And you can see that it's actually protected at many different angles from potential fetch and wind propagating across the estuary. But this reef that we lost in 2018 is not as protected. And so that is likely a correlating factor with the loss of these reefs. And so I'll also say that with all of these storms, we're seeing a pretty strong change in coastal geomorphology. These storms are going to lead to changes in our barrier islands and inlets, likely. And so I'm going to show you a video of Beaufort Inlet over time. So I'm sitting over here, actually, in Atlantic Beach, North Carolina. To orient you a little bit more also, this is Back Sound, North Carolina, where we have done most of our seagrass trawl surveys. This is the Newport River estuary and the North River, and both of these rivers have historically been really important for our oyster reef or oyster industries. And so I want you to pay attention particularly to Beaufort Inlet over time and what happens from 2011 or Hurricane Irene onwards. All right. So since 2011, Beaufort Inlet has widened by over 0.5 kilometer, which is pretty substantial. And if you take that into context with channelization and dredging of the inlet in order to maintain a shipping channel and the potential effects of relative sea level rise, that's going to be associated with an increase in the overall amount of volume of water that's in our estuaries and the oceanic influence within our estuaries in North Carolina. And so that it's going to change environmental regimes, and it's going to potentially lead to saltwater intrusion up estuary. So it has a lot of potential implications for our coastal habitats and ecosystems over time. But for now, what we can say in terms of what we've found for our research is that the seagrass habitat remains pretty stable over this past decade. And our fish communities are also pretty resilient as well. But we do know that greater intensity storms are associated with greater declines. And so we have to be very mindful about what this means in terms of the overall resilience of these communities in the future. And we also know that while our restored oyster reefs are largely resistant to storms, they're going to be very sensitive to the wind direction and storm surge. And we really need to be specific about where we place these reefs in the landscape in order to be able to maintain their resilience and survivorship over time. And so, when we think about the effects of hurricanes on coastal North Carolina, we really need to be cognizant of how it's going to affect the entire watersheds. So while I've focused a lot of my research in the past on the effects of storms right in our coastal ecosystems, we know that they can also be associated with massive storm surge that literally leaves riverine fishes out of water when those waters recede. They're going to have a massive impact to dunes, as well as the fact that they will flood riverine floodplains in portions of North Carolina that aren't just directly at our coastline. And so if we integrate not just restoration into resilience of our coastlines, but also thinking about resilience of the entire state as a whole, I think we can better protect the resources that we have come to really value in this state. And I'll just end with an acknowledgement of my funding sources and the many researchers over the last decade who have helped to conduct these trawl surveys. And this photo that I absolutely love that I took while I had evacuated from Hurricane Florence, that was a news report of what was going on. This NC mayor was in fact a student colleague of mine at Duke at the time. And I will say that, while we are experiencing some of the catastrophic effects of global climate change, I do think that there are reasons to believe that our ecosystems, that our people can be resilient to these changes, and we can stop it from being a Mike Tyson punch to the face. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
How about a great big round of applause for Stacy, wherever you happen to be? Virtual applause is perfectly fine. You can drop your appreciations in the chat. Very interesting and amazing research, Stacy. Very impressive. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I have to say that looking at a presentation that's going to be the impact of hurricanes on fishes and their ecosystems, I was steeling myself for like really terrible news. Because when we're talking about major storms, and when we're often talking about things like more intense storms more frequently.
Oh no.
At least naturally, they're very resilient ecosystems, like seagrass communities and coastal ecosystems kind of are built to be able to take these punches.
Yeah, I think I was not expecting to actually see how resilient the systems were either. But it was a sign of hope, and an indication to really like re-examine some of the things that I had come to believe and think about the way that ecosystems behave. Estuaries, I think, are just such an amazing ecosystem because they really do occur at this nexus of both fresh and saltwater influences. And so that means they experience, just even on a daily basis or a tidal basis, massive changes in the environmental regime. And so I think it means that these systems have likely evolved over time to be pretty resilient to environmental swings. And they've also been experiencing for probably centuries now tropical cyclones, and have potentially developed mechanisms, clearly like ways to be able to detect storms, especially for some of the fish species, in order to be resilient to these effects. And so I do think, this is a sign that our systems are they're doing okay in terms of hurricanes. But we really don't want to know what happens if you start seeing things like tropical Hurricane Florence happening over and over and over again, not just to our fishes, but to our communities as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and then I think about the impacts. I mean, if we're talking about North Carolina's coast, then at some point in the discussion, coastal development.
Mm-hmm.
To communities to adapt then when another hurricane flow comes through.
I'm sorry, I think my Zoom froze for a moment there. I caught coastal development and then hurricane flow at the very end.
Okay. Sorry about that. Well, I was just thinking about, you showed us so many images of the human impacts from hurricanes, flooded rivers and cities, right? And that tends to be what we think about the most. But then how coastal development impacts the ability of these ecosystems to remain resilient in the face of increasingly stronger and more frequent storms.
Yeah, it's true. I think naturally the systems have become adapted in a way that they are pretty resilient. But when we do start changing land use and land cover, it changes, not just the way that rainfall runs off and where it goes to, but it also changes things like potential storm surge as well, and mitigation of storm surge. Salt marshes can potentially help large salt marshes, I believe in the Gulf of Mexico, can help to dissipate some of the energy that's associated with storms. And so there's a lot to think about in terms of nature-based infrastructure that we can use to build resilient ecosystems or coastal communities over time, as well as just, thinking about the ways in which we interact with and build our communities so that we're not changing it in a way that, we're not taking out dunes to build on our barrier islands.
Precisely. Excellent. All right. Well, see what's happening over there right now because some questions are rolling in for you. Stacy, you ready for some questions?
Yeah.
All right. First one I see here. Wondering if you have seen any biological changes in the fish due to stresses they may perceive with these weather events.
That is a great question. So for our trawl surveys, we didn't directly note any changes in fish physiology and biology, but there have been several studies that have shown that their hurricanes are associated with an increase in disease prevalence in a number of different fish species. And so I actually think there's been a really great study from the Neuse River by researchers out of NC State that have shown that the disease prevalence increases. And so it is associated with an increase in morbidity or the likelihood of death and overall mortality of fishes after storms.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's, I wouldn't have considered that. I think about just how storms, might hurt or damage fish or leave them stranded on a roadside. But all of the minute interactions that happen too. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. The next one I have is from Lily. Is there a role for the historical specimens and data housed here at the museum for understanding longer-term changes to these fish communities?
That is a great question also. And I'm not so sure in terms of the hurricane research itself, but actually I am looking at long-term changes in overall estuary communities. And a lot of the information we have comes from historical records of where fishes have been caught. And I bet, I still remember actually, I was at the coast during Hurricane Irene, and we did some surveys and found fishes that you should not have found in the estuary. Like we found juvenile mahi in the salt marsh. And I think that could have potentially been because the storm washed in a lot of larval fishes. And I bet that there are collections at the museum that are documentations of when fishes have been found in our estuaries that they ordinarily would not have been. So yeah, I bet that's something that would be really cool to look into, and I should contact you.
That's Dr. Lily Hughes, research curator for ichthyology at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. I'm guessing looks like I just froze again. Let's see. The other things that I've got going on in the chat here are a bunch of people saying that this was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
So what are next steps for you then in pursuing research and looking at hurricanes and coastal ecosystems?
So something I'm really interested in is that trend we saw in changes in species richness during before periods. And so I'm really interested in looking at antecedent environmental conditions and how that affects the overall numbers of fishes that we see in our estuaries. I'm actually really interested in collaborating with people that are more atmospheric modelers and meteorologists to look at the changes in environmental conditions over time associated with hurricanes and how that really affects the number of fishes we see in our estuaries over time. I'm also very curious in terms of I've done a lot of work on coastal restoration and thinking about restoring across an entire watershed as opposed to just the coastline, so that you actually have interacting habitats that are going to be able to potentially mitigate some of the effects of floodwaters in our inshore states, while also mitigating potentially the effects of heat over land that you get that may potentially lead to it, that may prevent a storm from losing intensity as it starts moving over our actual terrestrial habitats. And so just, yeah, lots of different things to incorporate, a lot of collaborators that do some more atmospheric modeling and land, sea, atmosphere interchanges.
Very, very interesting. Interesting stuff. Although now I'm thinking about these the oyster reefs that get installed, the like living coastlines that a lot of coastal organizations are working on, and some of the ones that you looked at in the study that you presented here. And some of them you said sort of got wiped out by hurricanes. Most of them seem to make it through okay. Does your research help conservationists or organizations who are wanting to build more of these things to do kind of site planning?
So I think that's the direction we want to move in. A lot of what we're looking at in terms of the oyster reef survivorship is still ongoing research. But there are a lot of really great researchers that have looked into living shorelines and the fact that living shorelines actually can prevent erosion of your property if you have a waterfront property better than having a bulkhead. And so I think siting is going to be very important when you think about it in terms of placing an oyster reef into open water. But versus if you're placing it to protect your shoreline, it's a slightly different process, but also very important to think about in terms of the overall intensity of waves that you're going to get. So for example, an oyster reef may not actually be as great at protecting erosion on your property if you have a property that's pretty subject to a lot of waves in general, but maybe having like a rock living shoreline may be better at dissipating things like that.
Thank you. All right, let me see what we've got going on here back in the chat real quick. Let's see, I saw a question that popped up. Is your research good news for like oyster beds and seagrass beds? How do you sort of, what's the headline there for somebody who's concerned about coastal ecosystems?
I think my headline there is that, yeah, for now, it appears that our systems are pretty resilient to these storms. And so I think if you look at storms by themselves, then it is good news. I think if you can't just do that though, you have to understand how these ecosystems, how fish numbers are changing in the broader context. And so siloed view, I think it is good news for in terms of hurricane responses, but on the broader view, you know, we know that our fish communities are changing in general, that species are shifting their ranges. We know that the numbers in our estuaries are declining, and that's leading and associated with changes in how many fishes we can catch, both from a commercial and a recreational standpoint. And so we have to think about that in the whole context also, that if fish numbers as a whole are dwindling, does it really matter that a hurricane year is slightly that different from a control year if just the general trend is down? So, yeah.
Very, very interesting stuff. Stacy, thanks for being on the program today and sharing your research with us.
Thank you. It's been great to be here with y'all. And I should definitely have posted my email address in case anyone wants to contact me afterwards, but maybe I can put that onto like the Facebook. So.
Somebody where they could find, I wanted to know where they could find the paper that you were referencing for your presentation.
So our research actually is currently in review. And so hopefully in a couple of months, it should be, knock on wood, published in PLOS One, which is open access. So everyone should be able to get to it. But be on the lookout for some of the results from that in the next couple of months.
Excellent. There you go. Hey, folks. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery series. We will be back here, of course, next Wednesday at noon with another great presentation for you. So go ahead and mark your calendars, Wednesdays at noon, just for the whole month of April, because we're going to be talking about some great stuff and meeting very interesting people. You can see what programs are coming up by visiting the museum's website, naturalsciences.org, or head to eenorthcarolina.org to check out the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education. At their website, you can sign up for the email newsletter about this particular lecture series so that you know what programs are coming up, and you'll have the link in your inbox the day of with a reminder email every week. And you can stay in touch with all of us on social media. Yeah, we're there. Of course, who's not these days, right? The museum is at Natural Sciences on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And the Office of Environmental Education is at North Carolina Go and give everybody a follow. Until next time, everybody, take care, stay safe, do what you can to keep your community safe still, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.